this podcast, I'm going to talk a little bit about the planning aspects of, certainly photographing wildlife, but it does apply to anything that goes beyond the normal kind of holiday trip. So by that I mean maybe going off the beaten track essentially. And what partly has prompted this is that I'm doing a webinar in a couple of weeks. Well, I'm talking about photography for explorers. So, to me, an explorer is anybody who goes a little bit off the beaten track. So you're not on particularly an organized tour, unless it's more of a kind of safari type thing. But somewhere where you don't have ready access to power and that kind of thing, and maybe you are looking at wildlife. And obviously, with my interest in wildlife, that would tend to be the sort of spin I have on things. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is planning, which is largely what this particular podcast is about and the kind of things to think about. So from an animal perspective, first of all, there are a couple of things you need to think about. One is a kind of macro view of what's going on with the animals, and the second is more of a micro view. And what I mean by that is what happens seasonally. So, for example, if you wanted to photograph humpback whales off the coast of Sydney, you're only going to see them from roughly the end of May through to early November, generally. I mean, it will vary a little bit. You might get the odd whale outside of that, but that's pretty much what the whale watching season is in Sydney. And equally, there are those in Africa. You have those massive migrations of wildebeest, and they happen at a particular time of year. So depending on what it is you want to see, you first of all need to make sure you're going at the right time. So that's the sort of macro view of it, the seasonal view. There's also a smaller, the more micro view is what's happening on a weekly or daily basis. Now, some of that might be a larger split in the macro season. So, for example, and this isn't by any means 100% reliable, but it's simply an observation. Photographing whales going past Sydney, they tend to be more playful in the second half of the season, and you're more likely to get them swimming up to the boat and spy hopping and that sort of thing. What I've seen on the whole, on the first part of the season, is they're generally just wanting to get north. So they pretty much swim. You might get some breaching and jumping and all of that, but often they just want to get where they're going. So you might get those variations. Now, another factor to consider is also how wet and dry things are. So I was in Botswana in the end of January in 2020 and went out with some local guys. Now, I was just going across, basically overland between Namibia and Zimbabwe. So I was sort of passing through really, and grabbed some local guides on the way to look at different things. And what we found was that on that particular occasion, we couldn't see animals where they were expected because it'd been so wet. It meant there was a lot of food everywhere. So the prey animals, things like impala, those sorts of things, were off grazing pretty much wherever they wanted. And that meant that the carnivores, which were obviously hunting them, would follow them wherever they were going. Now, what the guide would normally do, because normally that time of year it's a bit drier than it was for us, they would normally go down towards waterholes because often in the drier parts of the season, that's the only place where animals can get water. So naturally, everything congregates there, prey animals and carnivores, because obviously the carnivores will go where the prey animals are. So if you know that you're going at a time of year where it's usually dry, you know that you're likely to find most of the animals around waterholes. So local guides are likely to be very helpful because in that situation, it's pretty predictable where the animals are going to be. But if you get a situation where there's been a lot of rain and maybe it's unusual, or the season's late or early, whatever it is, then that can often change things. So you do need to be aware of that. Some of your planning might be to just try and hit a particular part of the weather cycle and see what you see. But bear in mind that there can be local changes. So you might have an unusual week, or let's say where it just rains a lot, and that just changes the whole story. So you do need to be a bit flexible, and you do also need to understand to some extent what the habits are of the animals that you want to go and see. Now, if you're not looking at animals, the same rule applies, because obviously different times of year. And now I'm thinking of climbing Kilimanjaro. You can go in the sort of more summery months where although it's still cold up there, you won't get much snow. Whereas if you go when it is colder, you'll likely get snow up there. So that I'd imagine, not having been up there in snow, I imagine that makes the climb a bit more difficult because you've just got additional cold weather and you're likely to be wet for more of the time and all those kind of things. So again, that will obviously impact your clothing. Now, another thing I wanted to talk about was protecting your camera equipment because it's primarily a podcast about photography. So one of the best investments I made is a cover, and I'm just trying to remember who made it. I think it's Aqua Splash, Aqua something or other. It's basically a large spray or splash or spray cover, and it's designed to go over my Canon, either of them actually, the 5DS that I use or the 7D Mark II, fitted with a long lens. So I typically use a 100 to 400mm lens. So I've got the long cover which will work with that lens, and the idea is that it kind of attaches itself to the lens hood. It's on just an elasticated cover there that sits on the lens hood, and then at the back there's actually a different eyepiece. So you hold it in by removing the eyepiece and putting in their own eyepiece, and that will hold the cover on at the back. And then there are some holes underneath where you can just get your hands up and get to the camera controls. Why is that important? Well, I did originally buy it for whale watching because I have on occasion had my camera soaked because it's almost second nature for me to find the wettest part of the boat and stand there until I get a good drenching. But what I found was also that a few years ago when I was in Tanzania, I was just only traveling for a few days photographing animals, but I didn't have any cover on the camera, and I was occasionally switching from a long lens to a wide angle because I'd sort of taken a bit of a punt and only taken one body with me and sort of hope for the best. But what happened, there's a lot of very fine dust gets around, and you definitely don't want it on your sensor, obviously. But what was also happening in my particular case was the dust was getting on the terminals between the lens and the body of the camera. And on the last day, I was having to nurse the camera through because I kept getting a communications error coming up on my screen at the back, but between the lens and the body. So I'd have to take the lens off in as dust-free an environment as possible, clean the terminals, pop it back on, and then I'd be good for a little while, and then I'd get the same error coming up. So it was a real problem, and luckily my camera managed to last the distance. And then, of course, when I got back home to Sydney, I had the whole camera serviced. And that is another thing to think about, actually. If you do go to these environments where it is very dusty or very wet or whatever, do get your camera serviced, ideally once a year, just to make sure you don't have any corrosion going on or that there's dust accumulating somewhere you don't want it. It's just a good way of making sure the camera's good and it's ready to go next time you need to take it somewhere. So the point about this cover is that it was actually perfect for keeping dust out of the camera. So I was using it a lot the sort of end of 2019, beginning of 2020, when I was traveling around Southern Africa for a few months. And that cover was just really good because it kept everything clean, no dust anywhere. I was using it on the camera with the long lens. I had one of my other body with a wide angle on, but I would tend to keep that in my camera bag because I wasn't using it so often. But the long lens, I wanted it out. I wanted it in my lap so that if something happened, I was ready to go. So other than quickly taking the lens cover off and just keeping the lens clean, obviously, and I would do that the end of every trip. So usually it was getting cleaned twice a day anyway. The actual electronics themselves were fine. They worked perfectly fine. So if you are going in a dusty environment, I do suggest that you look at something that's designed as a splash cover because that will keep the dust out as well. So that's a hot tip. Now, another thing obviously to think about when you're traveling in more remote places is how you're going to keep your battery powered. So again, I normally have spare batteries, so I like to get the body extenders on my Canons. Both of them have got the extender on it, and that's designed to take a second battery. I just find with the grip it has just the grip and the weight, the center of gravity with that on, or center of balance really, on the camera with a long lens is just slightly back towards me a little bit, and I just find that makes a difference when I'm using the camera compared to using the body without the extender on the bottom of the body. So that is purely a personal preference thing. You might like that, you might hate it, but it does give you a bit of extra battery capacity for one thing. Um, Now, I have experimented with solar power chargers, and the one I used only didn't even make it out of Namibia. I wasn't very happy with it. It seemed okay when I was testing it out before I left Sydney, but once I was in the field with it, I found it a little bit unreliable. It wasn't always charging. I would think I had a battery on charging. In fact, I didn't. So that may have been down to me as well. So I'll certainly put my hand up and admit that I wasn't quite on top of using that as much as I perhaps could have been. And you may well have a solar powered setup that works very well for you. I certainly recommend that they're reasonably ruggedized so that you can just use them in a car. They're relatively waterproof as well in case it does shower when you've got it outside. Solar panels are getting much better now, and the solar cells themselves work much better. You can get a charge out of them in low light levels that a few years ago would have just floored it. So the technology is definitely moving on. So I think they are definitely worth considering. In my particular instance, I may have just been unlucky with the particular unit that I went with. Now, just as a backup to that, if that doesn't work, my absolute fallback, because I always have a laptop with me, is to use that as a spare battery charger, basically. So I bought a USB connected charger to fit my Canon batteries. So they're the same batteries in both cameras. So I've got four of them. And every time I got a chance, I would charge them on the mains. So anytime you need mains, you just pop them in the mains charger and get them as charged up as much as possible. But when I was away, and I spent a period, when certainly in Namibia, I was 3 or 4 days away from a charger, any sort of mains electricity. So luckily the batteries worked out, though I was kind of careful in how I was using the power on the cameras as well. But because I had the extra batteries, with 4 batteries, they were fine for that period, even though I was shooting a lot of photographs. And then the having the laptop as a kind of an emergency USB charger was good too. And the other thing about USB is that you might have access to a USB socket in a car if you're in a four-wheel drive. So quite often, in fact, I've been in four-wheel drives when I was in Tanzania. Actually, they even had a mains board set up that was sort of wired into the car. I didn't need to use it, but that was there if I needed it. So sometimes your local guide, if you're using a guide, will be able to provide you with a bit of power. The other thing I will say on batteries, when I was carrying the camera up Kilimanjaro, so there was Zippo power, and it was pretty cold. So I just had one battery in the camera. I'd taken the extender off just to really absolutely minimize my weight, because I was carrying a lot of other stuff too. So I was just trimming weight anywhere I could. And what I would do with the second battery, I'd have a spare that was always next to my body. So I was using my body heat to keep it warm, because lower temperatures, your camera batteries don't generally perform so well. So the idea was that if the battery did start to give up in the camera, I could quickly switch it out with the one that was sort of next to my body, as it were, in a t-shirt or something. It would be relatively warm, so that would be able to jump straight in and start working. So they're the sort of primary tips. Another thing I will say, and I've said this before, is that if you are looking, to photograph wildlife, I definitely recommend that you think about volunteering and looking at some of the volunteering programs. And the primary reason I say that is that your access to animals is likely to be much better. It's not always the case. I was helping with a project in Mozambique, and that was to do with whale sharks, and we ended up, we were just on regular tourist boats, so that really didn't work out well at all, unfortunately. But other trips I've done, land-based trips in private reserves, you basically get the same access to animals that people spending a huge amount of money to go to these private reserves spend, and there's nobody else around most of the time, so it's just you and the animals. And one of my pet hates is going to some of these big parks where it's just an absolute circus. Somebody finds some lions, and you've got 15 vehicles trying to, get in close and give their clients a view. So volunteering is really good from that perspective. Often you're the only people there. The other reason I recommend it is that you will, in my experience, always learn a lot more about the animals, the conservation process that that particular group is using, the sort of issues they face. I met the anti-poaching guys in definitely in Zimbabwe, and that was just really good, hearing their stories and what was going on there. And you just learn an awful lot more, not only about the animals, but about the local situation there, the local pressures, the local cultures, all of that stuff. So to me, that's much more rewarding. Now, definitely with some of the more organised, sort of more regular tourist trips, you can get very good guides as well who are very knowledgeable and can tell you a lot about what's happening. As I say, my experiences with conservation, these are people who are actively doing conservation, and many of them will have been doing it for most of their lives. You might have decades of experience there, and I've certainly heard things that really surprised me, really shocked me. Preconceptions that I'd had about conservation and what was the right thing to do with certain animals were just completely wrong. And most people are actually quite ill informed about the best ways to embark on conservation of certain animals. So that's a sort of final aspect of it, something else to think about. So I guess just to recap, as I've covered a few things there. So this is really about thinking ahead. It's about thinking about the environment you're going to be in. What's the weather going to be like? Obviously, things like clothing. You want to make sure that you're comfortable and you're warm, or you're able to stay cool if you're in a hot place, because it's very difficult to do anything if you're not well. Absolutely stay hydrated. That's an absolute fundamental. Just drink as much as you need to. When I was in hot environments and working, I'd easily be drinking 3 litres of water a day. So you need to make sure you've got a good canteen as well as your camera gear, because you do want to make sure that if you're off, excuse me, walking through the bush, that you can stay hydrated, because you never know what's going to happen. And so think ahead, think about the time of year you're going, what you're likely to see, what's normal. And then as it gets nearer, and obviously there are things like the paperwork, the visas, all the different things you need to have, vaccinations, all of that. I'm not really going to touch on that because I'm assuming that if you're thinking about that kind of trip, you'd be tuned in enough to do all that anyway. So think about the time of year and what's likely to be happening, what that you are likely to see. Maybe that you want to see a lot of young animals. When do these animals typically give birth? All this kind of stuff. And then as you get closer to the time where you're going, just have a look at the local conditions, because you may well find that you're going to a country where it's normally dry at that time of year, and so animals would be reasonably easy to find, but they've had a really good wet season or an unexpected period of rainfall, and it just changes everything. So do be very aware of that. Think about the gear that you want to take obviously what you need, but think about how you're going to keep it going as well. A final thing on memory cards. I don't keep copies in the camera, as long as I will while I've got space, because I have 2 cards in both my cameras. But I also take a solid state hard drive with me when I go, and that's linked to the laptop. So I always make sure I've got 2 copies of every image. So generally there's a backup set on the hard drive. So I've got a solid state 1 terabyte. In fact, I've got 2 of them, 2 1 terabyte hard drives that I use. I might keep one of the a compact flash as a backup in the camera, and then I'll use an SD card as the kind of working card. But I like to keep 2 copies if I can, but if you've got somewhere else to copy the images to, small external hard drives are very cheap these days, and they're quite rugged, a lot of them. I just wanted the solid state because I was going for an extended period and I didn't want any moving parts, and also I had a size and weight issue with what I was carrying. So those are other things to consider. And that is pretty much it. Think about how you're going to care for yourself, care for your camera, and just keep everything powered. So I hope you found that interesting. I will sign off right now and speak to you next time. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.